Hey everybody, in today's video we're going to be talking about the new firmware that's available for the Nikon Z9. This is firmware version 2.1. This is not going to be as big of an update as firmware version 2, hence the name 2.1, but there are definitely some features that are worth talking about. The two main ones that we're going to talk about in this video are going to be the new high frequency flicker reduction, and we're also going to talk about some of the new autofocusing changes as well. It's going to be a bit of a short video, but I thought I'd make a video just to show you guys how to use the new high frequency flicker reduction, how to assign it to a button, and what it looks like through the viewfinder. So hopefully you find it useful. So first of all, this high frequency flicker reduction, this is something that a lot of people have been waiting for. If you shoot indoor sports events, if you're shooting in a situation where you have artificial lighting, or you're in a situation where you have an advertising board in the background, generally anything that's like LED lit or anything that causes you problems with flicker or banding in some cases, then this is the setting that can really help you. So the way that this high frequency flicker reduction works is you cannot assign it to the I menu, which might have been useful in some cases, but I think having it on a button is going to be how most photographers want to use it anyways. So to use this, you have to assign it to a button. Now, it can be assigned to a number of different buttons. I'll put the list of buttons up here on this side, but you can assign it to a number of different buttons depending on which one works for you, depending on what your use case of your existing buttons are already. Once you assign this to one of your function buttons, this will allow you to see flicker more easily through the viewfinder in real time. So when you activate the high frequency flicker reduction, it also allows you to really control and narrow down your shutter speed. So it means that you can choose a shutter speed very specifically for your light situation or the LED panel or the advertising board that's in the background. So you can choose a very specific shutter speed. This will allow you to choose those specific shutter speeds from a 30th of a second up to 8,000th of a second. This option doesn't work anything higher than 8,000th of a second, and it doesn't work anything below a 30th of a second. But realistically, you're not going to be worrying about banding at either low shutter speeds anyway. It does obviously require you to manually dial that shutter speed in, so it's not like it's automatically choosing the shutter speed for you, so please do be aware of that. High frequency flicker reduction is only available in manual mode or shutter priority. You cannot use this in aperture priority for obvious reasons because you're not controlling the shutter speed. I think it's really useful for anybody that's shooting with kind of LED lights in the background or advertising boards, or if you're in a situation where there's just loads of lights in your background that you cannot control and they're causing you issues with either banding or flickering, or you might not have all the lights on at the same time. This just really allows you to dial that full shutter speed in. To assign this, you have to do this in your controls menu. So you go to your custom settings menu, controls, and then choose the button that you want to assign it to, whether that's function 1, whether that's function 3, whatever it is for your layout. And you can then decide to assign that to high frequency flicker reduction. And then when you push that button, that high frequency flicker reduction enables, and you can then dial in whatever shutter speed you want in relation to the flickering that's happening in front of you. It's also worth mentioning when you're using the camera between a 30th of a second and 2,000th of a second, you can really narrow down the shutter speed up to 96th of an EV stop. And if you're using the camera between 2,000th of a second and 8,000th of a second, you can really narrow down the shutter speed by 16th of an EV stop. When you have chosen the shutter speed that you want to shoot with, that shutter speed will be displayed to you using the decimal place, using the full shutter speed that you've chosen either on the back of the screen, in the viewfinder, and it will also show the new shutter speed to you on the top plate screen as well. So you're always aware of what shutter speed you're using. As I mentioned, it does require a bit of fine-tuning from your side, but once you've got that shutter speed dialed in, you should be set to go based on the lights that you're shooting with or the background lights that you have in your frame. Once you've dialed in what you think is your correct shutter speed, take a test shot, see if you're happy with that on the back of the camera, and then you know that that is a shutter speed that you then continue to use in that environment that you're in for the rest of the time that you're shooting there. You will need to change that if you are moving to different screens or moving to different advertising boards and lighting and so on, so do be aware of that. I do think for a lot of photographers this is going to be a function that they do use a lot in the background, so having it on a primary button like function 1, 2 or 3 is going to be quite useful, but as I mentioned, you can also assign it to buttons on your lenses as well if you wanted to as well. When it comes to the autofocus improvements, I've not been able to get out and test the autofocus improvements as much as I would like, but I'm just going to talk you guys through some of the improvements and some of the things that you might expect to see on version 2.1. So there's 3 main changes that have been made to autofocus. The first one is that the camera finds it easier to detect and follow and track smaller subjects, whether that's a smaller bird in the background, whether it's a smaller subject that's further away from you, or whether that's using a lens that isn't quite long enough and therefore the subject is smaller in the frame. The camera's going to find it easier to find a smaller subject in the background to keep them in focus when you're following them or tracking them. It means that it's less likely to focus on the background or less likely to lose that subject and go and focus on something else. I've also tried to get some examples of this. I definitely think that it is better at locking onto smaller birds in the frame. One of the things I always used to say about following birds is that you have to be aware of how big the subject is in your frame, and that does make a difference if you're using a focal length that's a little bit shorter. But now I do feel like it will definitely lock onto subjects at a greater distance and lock onto them more consistently than it ever did before without losing them or going to focus onto the background or anything else. So I've been pretty impressed with those changes. The second change is that they've made adjustments to the focus accuracy when you're in AFC and using face and eye detect. So this will give you a more consistent autofocus on faces and eyes, less of the camera focusing on nose and ears and things like that. So hopefully it gives you a better idea about using eye autofocus, using it for people. I've not tested that, but I've been pretty happy with the other changes made to autofocus. So I would imagine that those of you that do use eye autofocus and eye and face tracking a lot should see an improvement when you're in AFC and tracking and following a person moving around in front of the camera, which is always a good thing. And I suppose this is a really important one for loads of different types of photographers. The instances where the camera would not focus on the subject and then focus on the background. So the camera will be much less likely to focus on the background or lock onto something in the background rather than it focusing on what your main subject is in the foreground, especially if it's a smaller subject or something that's in your foreground and you're trying to get the camera to focus on that. As always, there are lots of other changes and bug fixes. I'm not going to go through all those bug fixes, but I just want to take a little bit of time to talk you through the new high frequency flicker reduction, because that's definitely a setting that a lot of people have asked me about. And also just wanted to show you some of the things that I found on the focusing settings as well. As always, I'm pretty happy with all the new firmware updates. I do appreciate that there's currently a lot of firmware updates for the Z9, but generally keeping the camera up to date is fairly straightforward. One thing I would note is, and I've done this, I speak from experience, if you upgrade to 2.1 and then go back to firmware 2, it completely resets all of my settings. So I just have a completely new Z9 now that I need to go back and change all of my settings for. So yes, just be aware of that if you do update to 2.1 and you want to go back to firmware 2, it will just reset all of your settings. So please do be aware of that, if any of you are out there doing that. But most people will update to 2.1 and then stick to 2.1, so just be aware of that. Right, I hope that you found this short video useful, just a bit of an insight into a small firmware update. If you have any questions, if there's anything you're unsure about, then do let me know, put them in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video very soon. The next video will be, and I've kind of listened to you guys, that lots of people wanted to ask about the 400 with the 1.4 times teleconverter, so I've got some very quick kind of sample shots at that, so that video will be up in the next few days. So thank you all very much for watching. I will see you very soon. I hope you find this video useful. Let me know if you have any comments, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thank you. Goodbye.